What if the story of America's presidency wasn't just about power, but about outsiders who defied it? From accidental leaders and grieving generals to professors blinded by ideals, history is littered with presidents who stumbled into chaos and changed the nation forever. These men weren't career politicians. They were rebels, reformers, and tragic figures whose rise and fall shaped the very soul of American democracy. Welcome to Top 10 Forgotten American Presidents who were political outsiders before Donald Trump. At number 10, we have the man of granite, Grover Cleveland, a political phenomenon unlike any other in American history. Rising from humble beginnings as the mayor of Buffalo to governor of New York, Cleveland's meteoric ascent to the presidency in just 3 years was nothing short of a political revolution. What made him so extraordinary was his image as a reformer in an age drenched in corruption, a man with no deep party ties. Backed by both Democrats and the reformist Republicans known as the Mugwumps, Cleveland's view of the presidency was almost monarchic. He believed he served the people directly, not the political machine. This rigid independence made him both admired and despised. He vetoed hundreds of private pension bills and took a hardline stance for the gold standard, alienating farmers, laborers, and even his own party. His unyielding integrity led to political isolation, and he lost his re-election bid in 1888. Yet, in an unprecedented twist, the American public brought him back 4 years later, making him the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. His second term, however, ended in disaster with the Panic of 1893, a financial collapse that crushed his popularity. Cleveland's legacy remains that of a man too honest for his own good, an outsider who tried to rise above politics, only to be broken by the brutal realities of American democracy. Still, his name endures as a symbol of moral reform and stubborn independence during one of the most corrupt eras in U.S. history. At number 9, we encounter the dandy reformer Chester A. Arthur, one of the most unexpected transformations ever seen in the White House. Before fate thrust him into power, Arthur was the ultimate Washington insider, a loyalist of the corrupt Republican machine led by Senator Roscoe Conkling. Known as the gentleman boss of New York's spoil system, he reveled in the perks of patronage. But destiny intervened when President James Garfield was assassinated by a deranged office seeker, exposing the very corruption Arthur once thrived in. When he suddenly inherited the presidency, many Americans expected him to continue business as usual. Instead, Arthur underwent a moral awakening that stunned the nation. Defying his old allies, he championed and signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, replacing political favoritism with a merit-based bureaucracy. The same man who had once represented the swamp became the architect of reform that drained it. Despite his elegant style, lavish parties, and reputation as a fashionable dandy, Arthur emerged as a principled leader who valued integrity over loyalty. Though he only served 1 term and never sought re-election due to illness, his transformation from machine man to moral reformer remains one of the most remarkable redemptions in presidential history. Chester A. Arthur's story proves that even the most unlikely figures can rise above corruption to reshape the American political landscape. At number 8, we uncover the compromise that failed Millard Fillmore, a man thrust into the presidency by tragedy and destined to preside over one of America's most explosive moral crises. When President Zachary Taylor died suddenly in 1850, Fillmore, his quiet and cautious vice president, found himself unexpectedly in charge of a fractured nation teetering on the brink of civil war. A self-made lawyer and intellectual, Fillmore believed that the Constitution and, by extension, the Union must be preserved at all costs. His first act as president was to push through the Compromise of 1850, a sweeping legislative package meant to calm sectional tensions between North and South. While the compromise briefly soothed the Union's divisions, it contained a fatal flaw: the Fugitive Slave Act, which forced Northern citizens to aid in the capture of escaped enslaved people. Fillmore's rigid commitment to law and order led him to enforce this act zealously, alienating abolitionists and inflaming public outrage across the North. Though he believed he was saving the nation, his decisions accelerated the very tensions that would explode into the Civil War. By the time he left office, both parties had abandoned him, viewing him as a symbol of moral weakness disguised as moderation. Fillmore's presidency serves as a haunting reminder that compromise without conviction can be as destructive as conflict itself. a tragic tale of a political outsider who sought unity but unwittingly deepened America's greatest divide. At number 7, we meet His Excellency, the pariah John Tyler, the man who rewrote the Constitution's unwritten rules and paid the ultimate political price. Thrust into the presidency by the sudden death of William Henry Harrison after just 31 days in office, Tyler instantly faced a constitutional and political earthquake. The Whigs, his own party, insisted he was merely an acting president, but Tyler defied them all, boldly declaring himself the legitimate president of the United States, setting a precedent that would shape every succession to come. This iron-willed Virginian was a states' rights purist and an outsider to the Whig establishment, which soon turned on him with fury. When he repeatedly vetoed their national bank bills and resisted congressional control, Henry Clay and the Whig elite held a public ceremony to expel him from their party, an unprecedented humiliation. Suddenly, America had a president with no party, no allies, and no agenda that Congress would support. Yet, in political exile, Tyler used his freedom to achieve one monumental victory: the annexation of Texas. This bold act expanded U.S. territory and inflamed the debate over slavery that would later divide the nation. John Tyler's presidency stands as a cautionary tale of independence taken to its extreme proof that even necessary defiance can lead to political isolation. At number 6, we find the professor's failed piece Woodrow Wilson, the academic visionary whose intellect changed the world but whose pride shattered his dream. The only U.S. president with a Ph.D., Wilson was a scholar turned statesman, rising from the presidency of Princeton University to the governor's mansion in New Jersey, and then to the White House. He arrived determined to apply scholarly logic and moral purpose to politics, championing progressive-era reforms like the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Trade Commission, and the first federal income tax. Yet, his true ambition was global transformation. After World War I, Wilson envisioned the League of Nations, a new international body designed to end war through collective security and diplomacy. His 14-point speech promised a moral blueprint for world peace, and for a brief moment, he was revered as the savior of democracy. But his idealism collided headfirst with political reality. Upon returning home, he refused to negotiate with the Senate over the Treaty of Versailles, treating politics like an academic seminar rather than a field of compromise. His arrogance and inflexibility ensured the treaty's rejection and America's retreat into isolationism. A debilitating stroke soon followed, leaving his wife, Edith Wilson, to unofficially manage presidential affairs. Wilson's tragedy lies in his fatal flaw, believing reason alone could conquer power politics. His story is a haunting lesson that intelligence without flexibility and vision without collaboration can turn even the noblest crusade into a ruinous failure. At number 5, we descend into darkness with the shadow of sorrow, Franklin Pierce, a man whose personal grief became the nation's political curse. Virtually unknown before his nomination, Pierce was the Democrats' compromise candidate, a handsome war hero and smooth orator meant to unite the North and South without controversy. But tragedy struck before he even took the oath of office. Just weeks before his inauguration, a train accident killed his only surviving child before his eyes, leaving both Pierce and his wife emotionally devastated. The president entered the White House as a hollow, grieving man, unable to focus or lead with conviction. Into this vacuum stepped powerful forces of division. Seeking stability, Pierce threw his support behind Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act, a catastrophic piece of legislation that repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed new territories to decide the fate of slavery by popular vote. The result was immediate and horrifying. Armed conflict erupted in Kansas, with pro-slavery militias and abolitionist settlers turning the prairie into a blood-soaked battleground known as Bleeding Kansas. Pierce's passive leadership and misguided enforcement of pro-slavery laws deepened the national rift. He became seen as a weak, mournful figure who allowed the Union's moral foundation to rot from within. Franklin Pierce's presidency is a tragic portrait of how personal despair and political indecision can combine to unleash national catastrophe. His story remains one of the most somber and haunting chapters in the history of America's forgotten outsider presidents. At number 4, we salute the general's blind spot, Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War hero who conquered the battlefield but was defeated by politics. Emerging from the ashes of war as the Union's savior, Grant entered the White House on a wave of patriotic fervor, yet with no experience in civilian government. His greatest strength, unwavering loyalty, became his fatal flaw. Determined to heal the wounds of war and uphold justice, Grant used his presidential authority to enforce the 15th Amendment and crush the Ku Klux Klan with unprecedented federal power, safeguarding the fragile progress of Reconstruction. But while he fought courageously for civil rights, his trust in those around him allowed corruption to fester. His administration became synonymous with scandal. The Credit Mobilier, the Whiskey Ring, and the Indian Ring, a parade of fraud and bribery that stained his presidency. Grant himself remained personally honest and idealistic, but he was disastrously blind to the greed of his subordinates. His military decisiveness could not substitute for political oversight, and his naivete crippled the moral authority of his government. Ironically, Grant's failure to control corruption undermined the very Reconstruction efforts he had worked to defend, eroding public confidence in the federal government for decades. Yet, in history's long view, Grant stands as a tragic hero, a man of integrity whose military virtues proved ill-suited for political survival, reminding us that victory in war does not guarantee triumph in peace. At number 3, we find the engineer who couldn't fix America, Herbert Hoover, the brilliant humanitarian who discovered that technical genius cannot mend human despair. Before his presidency, Hoover was a global hero, a self-made millionaire mining engineer who organized massive relief operations during and after World War I, feeding millions and earning worldwide respect. His 1928 election promised a new age of scientific management. In government, a presidency driven by reason, efficiency, and economic precision. But when the Great Depression struck in 1929, Hoover's rigid technocratic mindset became his undoing. He approached the economic collapse like an engineering challenge, believing the system could correct itself if properly managed. Rejecting direct federal relief as morally corrosive, he insisted on voluntary charity and business cooperation instead of government intervention. As unemployment soared and breadlines grew, his detachment and adherence to laissez-faire ideology made him appear heartless and out of touch. Public anger exploded, and Hooverville's shanty towns of the homeless became grim symbols of his failure. Ironically, his instincts for efficiency blinded him to the emotional and social needs of a suffering nation. The very intellect that once saved millions abroad now paralyzed him at home. Hoover's presidency remains a defining tragedy of misplaced faith in expertise, a cautionary tale showing that no amount of technical brilliance can replace empathy, adaptability, and political courage when a nation is in crisis. At number 2, we salute old rough and ready's last fight, Zachary Taylor, the rugged war hero whose battlefield valor could not navigate the minefield of American politics. A lifelong soldier with no political background, Taylor had never even voted before his election. The Whigs, desperate for a national icon, saw in him a unifying figure untarnished by partisanship. But once in office, his military instincts clashed fatally with political realities. Taylor ruled the White House as if it were a command post, direct, stubborn, and uncompromising. When the fierce debate over slavery in the Western Territories erupted, threatening to tear the Union apart, Taylor refused to yield to the Southern firebrands demanding expansion of slavery. Instead, he warned that he would personally lead the army to hang any man who dared rebel against the Union. This declaration of war against his own section sent shockwaves through Congress and nearly triggered a national crisis. But before the confrontation could reach its peak, Taylor died suddenly after just 16 months in office, likely from illness caused by contaminated food and exhaustion. His death cleared the way for Millard Fillmore's more conciliatory approach, delaying but not preventing the Civil War. Taylor's presidency, brief yet explosive, reveals how military command and democratic governance can collide disastrously when principle outruns political skill. His story embodies the danger of mistaking blunt courage for leadership in a nation built on negotiation. And finally, at number 1, we reach the 31-day tragedy, William Henry Harrison, whose brief, ill-fated presidency became the shortest and one of the most consequential in American history. A decorated general famed for his victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe, Harrison was celebrated as a humble, log cabin hero of the people. In truth, he was an aging aristocrat seeking redemption through the populist energy of the 1840 campaign, the first modern, mass-media political spectacle. Determined to prove his vigor and silence critics who mocked him as frail, Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in history, nearly 2 hours, coatless in freezing rain. Days later, he fell ill with pneumonia and died after just 31 days in office. His death plunged the nation into uncharted constitutional chaos. The founders had never clarified whether the vice president should act as president or become president. John Tyler's insistence on the latter interpretation permanently shaped the line of presidential succession. Harrison's tragic end was more than a personal misfortune. It was the first great test of America's executive system. In his desperate bid to appear strong and legitimate, he instead left a nation stunned, leaderless, and uncertain. His presidency, though fleeting, marked the moment when symbolic leadership met mortal consequence, proof that even the most well-meaning outsider can unravel the republic's stability with a single, fatal act of pride. The stories of these forgotten presidents remind us that the White House is not just a stage for competence. It's a battlefield of persuasion, compromise, and human complexity. Outsiders like Hoover and Wilson prove that genius without flexibility can collapse under pressure, while figures like Arthur and Grant showed that even inexperience can yield fleeting triumphs. Yet history's verdict is clear. The same traits that make outsiders appealing often ensure their political downfall. The presidency demands not purity, but adaptability, the art of surviving the impossible. If you enjoyed this deep dive into America's forgotten political outsiders, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating historical content. Thanks for watching.